The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am your host, Greg, your favorite host. But hey, I also brought a know-it-all with me, and his name is Tylor. Hello, Tylor. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and I take know-it-all as a compliment, not an insult. So that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Greg. I mentioned last time I have a countdown that is getting very close. I can say at the end of this episode, I will stop grumbling about this book and start saying at least the book is getting slightly better. And isn't that something we're all really looking forward to? We are just about at the halfway point, Greg. So before we dive into just a summary, we don't have an ill-advised discussion this week. I'm curious where you are at just in terms of about the halfway mark. How are you feeling about this book?
Tylor, our discussions are always ill-advised, even when they're not about visual media in a non-visual format. I'm feeling pretty good. I am certainly not as grumbly as you are. I anticipate that just means the back half of this is going to be much, much stronger. And so in retrospect, this feels kind of iffy for you. But, again, my silliest metric is just how quickly I go read the book after we finish recording. And, last week, I think we recorded on Sunday, and I think I had read it on Monday pretty quick. Now, I also had a bunch of stress at work I was trying to avoid, so that might have been part of it too. But generally, I keep reading again pretty quickly, which tends to mean I'm enjoying this. I like watching the pages tick away. We were just talking off air that, we've had these really short chunks, so it feels in some ways like we're spinning our wheels just because it's like we're only getting that little piece each episode. But spoilers for the very end of the episode. It's a big chunk for next time up to the larger end of what we're on. I think 35 in my mass market paperback edition. So excited for that. I will say, and maybe this is one other sign that I'm enjoying our project, is I keep ending up at bookstores killing time, sniffing around the Brandon Sanderson, because I'm like, I know these are really popular and I know they're connected to Wheel of Time, and not in a mythology sense, but in the author helped blah, 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 blah. So I think it's really good that it's impenetrable where to start with him. Like if it was a 14 book series over there, I probably would have bought book one by now. But every time I'm like, oh, it's like 8 different sagas or whatever. And I'm sure the experts are freaking out at me right now, but I'm like, I have no idea what to do. I'll just walk away.
I have strong atypical opinions about Brandon Sanderson, so I can discuss those off the air, but on air, I don't want to be ripped apart. So we're good on this one. It's glad to hear that you're kind of excited about this, because I think this is exactly where I was the first time I read this book. And we've discussed this a couple of times. I find myself lower on the book than you are. And I think it's mostly just because it's the millionth time that I'm reading this one. Unlike some of the later books that I've read 5 times, this one was around all of my childhood. I have read this one a lot, and I think it maybe suffers for that a little bit. But that being said, that also means get excited, readers. I can probably do the summary of these next 2 chapters more or less with my eyes closed. I'm not going to try, but let's summarize chapter 20, Saidin. So we begin with Rand pushing the group through the night, only allowing brief breaks for the horses and for Loyal to rest. A couple of times, Celine asks after the horn, and every time she does, she's rebuffed by Rand. Initially, he kind of says that the reason why is because he doesn't want to expose them to the dagger, but over time, he starts kind of drawing on a variety of different reasons because Celine kind of keeps pushing it no matter what his explanation is. During this kind of time, Rand is really relieved that he is kind of done with Aes Sedai. He thinks about how bad it is that Matt has to deal with them when he's going to be healed by the dagger. And then he asks Celine again whether or not she is Aes Sedai, and she immediately freaks out about it, to the point that it seems from the narration that she is mad 2-3 days later when they see that there is a village nearby. They decide that they are going to stay there despite Celine not being happy about it. And as they are making their way, Rand sees a glint of light and decides to go see what it is. And when he goes to something, it appears to be a pit that has been dug into the ground, and rising out of that pit is a hand that is holding a crystal orb. Rand seems almost transfixed by the orb, and he suddenly finds himself not even wanting to be in the void and is suddenly surrounded by the light of Saidin. He resists it over and over again and suddenly starts muttering to himself. Apparently, we will talk about what he muttered in our discussion. Eventually, Rand, it seems like he grasps Saidin briefly, shouts, and then stops, doesn't realize what has gone on. He literally asks the others whether he has done anything, and at the answer of no, he didn't, he more or less immediately ushers them towards the village. And Rand basically says, I'm terrified of what just happened. You should run away with me. Rand refuses. End of chapter. So that is a lot to describe a chapter that I think is actually really internal, which is an interesting dynamic. Normally, when I have a lot to say in the description, it's often a lot of action. That's not really the case here. What was your take on this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you describe it, you had way more like in my notes and thinking about it, because I do think it really didn't stand out all that much to me. So the big thing for me was the statue that captured my imagination and drew me in. And again, I think it's another one of these moments where you're like, oh, okay, this mythology is bigger than we've been thinking about, or different than we've been thinking about it. I do still feel like those moments often feel like Lord of the Rings, when they would pass by some where it came from or how, or maybe identify it with the people. And this is kind of even more mysterious. They seem to know less about it, and it's just being excavated within the culture around it, essentially. And so that's kind of where I fixated, but it certainly felt like let's just move our characters along type chapter to me. And I don't really mean that dismissively, but just kind of get us where we need to be.
Yeah, speaking of getting us where we need to be, we usually need to be at the beginning of the chapter. And I actually have a quick comment at the very beginning of the chapter. I think this is possibly a new use of the Dragon's Fang icon compared to the way that we've seen it used before. We had talked about it as being a sign of dark friends, or possibly a sign of dragons or false dragons. In this chapter, it seems like it's being directly related to the male side of the One Power. That might be another way of using this symbol that we haven't really considered so far. So, mini ill-advised discussion of a fairly small visual media. At the beginning of the chapter, though, I think you're right. The first half of this chapter is what I kind of describe as travel time, which in Dungeons and Dragons games I DM, I often just say, do you have anything you want to do? No. Okay, 4 days pass. And Robert Jordan doesn't quite do that here, but 3 days of skimming is actually pretty good for a couple pages on Robert Jordan. Were there any character moments that jumped out at you, or was it pure just like they were on their horses?
I'm going to use the opportunity to shout out our one identified listener, Ben, who texted us actually in response to 2 episodes ago, but we just got the text saying that Celine felt like a DM who was losing control of her game. I think that's paraphrasing, but that's roughly what it was, which I thought was very funny, and meaning when they encounter her in the Upside Down or whatever it's called here, that she's like, she wants them to go with her, and then it's like they're not listening, so there's a monster, and then they're really not listening, so there's like a crowd of monsters. And there is a little bit of that kind of tone in these, actually in a few of their interactions across this chapter, but this constant feeling like she is constantly, now I'm just repeating words, but drawing them back to the horn. It's like, nope, you really care about the horn, right? The horn is what you want to be after. You want all the glory of the horn and the great hunt. And it's like, no, that very much feels like I think of it more in video games, honestly, than Dungeons and Dragons, because I have a spectacular DM. But it is just that thing where it's like, you can do whatever you want, but there's this really cool thing you should probably think about first.
Yeah, I've actually recently been playing a game that is like built on the Dungeons and Dragons rule set. And there is a bunch of things that I'm like, I am going to try to build a party with no one who is big and strong. It's going to be all Dexy characters. And suddenly I can't get to like 1/8 of the hidden things in dungeons because you need to break down doors. And I hate it so much. That's exactly what we're describing here. And I think you're exactly right. And this is partially why I feel like this is one of the plot lines that frustrates me rather than exciting me, is because it does feel so railroaded. It feels like one of those moments where Rand doesn't have a lot of agency other than just to say, no, not that. He's not really driving. He's just keeping them away from some sort of disaster. And that's just not the most fun thing to read about for your main character to be going through. That's, I guess, where I'm at. It's not exciting. I wish it was a little more exciting.
Well, and so tied to that feeling that she's frustrated by him losing focus is this kind of moment she snaps at him when he calls her, or he doesn't call her, but he asks if she's Aes Sedai, and she's becoming kind of cold and tiresome, it seems, to Rand as well. And that's just this moment where it's like clear, oh, okay, that seems to deeply insult her, and so the facade kind of drops a little because she's so angry that that's the direction she links him. So yeah, that to me is kind of the character moment that stood out the most. Is it's like this flare up and this flashpoint, and I think this is probably a little more tied to next chapter, but it becomes clear in how she's losing track of Rand that she's really afraid of being discovered. And that's what's really drawing her actions and manipulating him, trying to get him away from the statue and away from all these people who could potentially identify the holes in her story. So I think this is a very early kind of flare up of that emotion. Like, she could control everything in the Upside Down, but here she really can't, and it's going to fall apart really quickly.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I hear in my notes, I have sometimes big stars and little stars. I had wanted to say something about this, but the full extent of my thoughts was a little star and next to it sus. So thank you for being much more descriptive than I was able to be. I actually think that what you're saying about how Rand is kind of almost feeling abandoned by Celine, right? There's 2 or 3 days after he asks about whether she's an Aes Sedai that she's very icy and seems like she's not really interacting with him at all. I think that is very interesting, given that the immediate next scene we have includes Celine kind of begging in a way that she hasn't before, even for the Horn of Valir, for him to just step away from the statue, and he doesn't respond to it. And so I think that tells us both simultaneously Celine's relationship with Rand has changed in those few days, but also something really, really weird is going on with this statue, because it was powerful enough to pull an 18-year-old boy away from the succubus who is trying to get him attracted to her. Like, that is hard to do. Do you have any initial thoughts? And then obviously we're always open to wild theories about what is going on with the statue and Rand, because it obviously doesn't seem to affect anyone else.
Just to layer on some more details by way of kind of answering your question, it's also in the presence of the statue that he really just pushes aside the void, if I have those details correct. And it's, I actually don't need that. And this kind of pull to the void that's been happening since Celine came into the picture. To me, it just kind of crystallized the picture going on. It's like, yep, okay, so Celine is a power of darkness and the statue is the power of light. Now, in my head, that gets a little backwards because it's the Saidin, which is usually the dark half of the black and white cookie.
Yep.
And maybe that's where we can kind of lean into the dragon's claw, dragon's tooth, because that's the side of the black and white cookie, but
Yep.
it is in the image, it is mixed black and white. It's not actually pure black or pure white. So maybe I think this is reading a little too much into a symbol they just like to use repeatedly, but it's like, there is something about that side right now that is saving Rand, even if there are risks associated with that dark power. And, I think large picture speculation, I'm starting to feel like the world has misunderstood the Saidin, that because the male Aes Sedai went mad, I think there's this presumed darkness or danger to it. And I think, there's a lot in Star Wars about finding someone who can find the balance and, seeking balance. And I feel like there's a little of that going on here. And because the Saidin has been pushed so far aside, maybe it's asserting itself a little bit more, but at least in Rand's life, it seems to be a saving grace.
Yeah, and I think that this is what Robert Jordan is kind of playing around with here, is he is taking what feels like from kind of the original Arthurian myths that he might be drawing from, or kind of a lot of the mythology that he likes to draw from. He's taking a lot of images of characters that are really positive. I think last week when we were talking about Celine, you talked about the Lady in the Lake. Obviously, her name is taken from the goddess of the moon, goddess of the hunt, something like that.
Sounds right.
She's all of these positive images, and yet we have this very strong feeling that she is very dark. And then simultaneously, as you're saying, Rand is kind of being tempted by this dark power within himself, but there are all of these hints that him using that power may be a necessary thing, right down to the fact that he is a prophesied whatever he is. That probably suggests that his use of the power will have some ramifications that aren't entirely, hopefully, terrible. So
yeah,
I think this is kind of where Rand is stuck, is he is grappling with the world having told him all of his life how terrible this is. And now he's got 3 weeks of, well, it's kind of necessary, and the most beautiful woman I've ever met wants me to do it. So that's pretty even on the scales, I feel like.
Yeah, and looking forward, it seems like he's going to finally commit, and that's when things are going to actually start to matter with Rand. And I can certainly imagine how frustrating it is to just see him spend a book and a half like, gee whiz, I don't know. And so to find him committing to whoever his identity is and whatever use of the power he's comfortable with, I think is an exciting development I'm anticipating in the back half of this book.
So speaking of figuring out his identity, I would actually like to draw our attention to when Rand finally grasps towards the light and he begins muttering to himself. He starts talking about spitting and Sightblinder's eye and a couple of other things. Did you recognize or pick up anything about where that is coming from? Because we have actually seen it a couple of times before.
No, I did not. And I'm not even grokking where it is in the chapter. So you're saying it's when he's in the presence of the statue and pushes aside the void?
Yeah, so you will notice it by it having a whole bunch of line breaks all in a row. You'll see there are like some italicized will not, and then after not, we get till shade is gone, till water is gone, into the shadow with teeth bared to spit in Sightblinder's eye on the last day. And day is the word that he shouts as he finally grasps the light and then comes out of his trance.
Yep. Okay, so I got it. It's on 310, 311 for anybody else on the mass market book,
or $2.95 in the trade paperback.
The Barnes and Noble I was at today had those ones, and they're beautiful. I don't know that I've seen them lately. This doesn't sound familiar to me. So I'm sure you can just answer where it's from, but it certainly sounds more like where we started at Dragon Mount or some of those like really mythic moments, maybe in the foretelling or something like that. But it certainly has a very epic poetry to those lines.
Yeah, so this is actually something we originally had reference to in the first book when Loyal and I believe Perrin at one point both independently learned about Aiel, who were dying, and this was very similar to the way that they were talking about the Dark One. They talked about Sightblinder. They used a couple of other similar references, and then this specific phraseology, I believe, earlier in this book when we had a discussion of Rand's heritage. This was mentioned as the way that Aiel basically swear how long they are going to fight the Dark One. So it strikes me, my initial impression upon seeing this is that in the same way that we have seen Matt or Perrin, their kind of, it's called the old blood comes out in them in the form of them speaking the ancient words of Manetheren. It seems that Rand may in some way be exhibiting his Aiel heritage and showing some of, that relationship. As we're talking about his identity coming through, it comes through very strongly here. It's just it's a pretty subtle hint. So now that you're seeing that alternation between Rand kind of rejecting the power and then that, his heritage coming out in the form of that creed, does that change your read on this scene? And also kind of tied up in that is, what was your original read on the scene? How did you take it?
I mean, I was caught up in the Selene Rand dynamics, and that, because she was so pushing him away from the statue and towards the void, it just seems like he was making a clear rejection of that. And then their dynamic changes for the rest of the chapter and really into the next, although there are other complicating forces there. With this extra information, I had started to piece that together just as you were saying it too, that, this is, we have had these hints that he is of Aiel blood, and that's his stature and his eye color, right?
Yes, and his hair color.
So the idea that he is, so what stands out to me in all that is like, okay, so he's not going to be just the savior of one of these many cultures, but he seems to be embodied and foretold across many of them in different ways, which fits a chosen one narrative. They all get like a different version of what that's going to look out like, but that he could easily claim title across them just means, we're headed to something epic. And, that's generally expected in a fantasy series.
I mean, when you say we only are, 12 books away from finishing, you kind of need to expect a little bit of epic. Honestly, other than just to mention Rand refusing Selene's call to run away with him, I don't have anything else really in this chapter. Any last thoughts that you have before we move on?
No, I mean, I feel like we didn't talk a lot about the statue itself. I'm really curious. Obviously, its powers are interesting, but I want to know why it's here, why it's buried, why it, contains all that power and seems to have just been underground. Yeah. And now it's seemingly becoming a piece in the kind of gamesmanship of the lords of this region. So that to me reads as they don't actually know what they're dealing with. They just want something pretty and a cool work for their part of the kingdom. So I'm very curious about that, and just don't want listeners to think because we didn't talk about it, we don't care. I think it's just there's not a lot to say yet.
Yeah, we are aware of the mystery, and I wish I could say more, and I very, very much can't. Let's then move on to something that I can say something about. Chapter 21, The Nine Rings, which definitely, according to Michael Livingston, is a reference to The Lord of the Rings. This chapter begins with them entering the tavern, and it is surprisingly not empty. It seems that there are maybe a half a dozen soldiers who are in the dining room, as well as an officer. Loyal and Rand immediately tell every bit of information about themselves down to exactly where they are from. It seems a little weird. They're not hiding anything. And the innkeeper immediately asks whether or not they're hunters for the horn. It seems that everyone is aware that the horn is launching either soon or has already started. And so when you see someone in fancy dress traveling in a infrequently traveled area, that's what everyone assumes. It, of course, freaks Rand out immediately. They then have some dinner. They note the innkeeper notices Rand's flute and asks him to play, and is at first surprised that it's actually Rand who plays the flute. She assumed that it was going to be one of the servants. He plays, they sing songs, hooray. Afterwards, the officer approaches and starts questioning Rand. He's clearly kind of like hinting at things and making Rand correct him to test whether or not he is who he says he is. He then asks after Celine, and immediately there is an accident in the kitchen, and then she says she needs to leave right away. She does. She goes to her separate room, and then Rand has a brief conversation with the officer, and this is where we get all of the information that you were talking about before with the statue, that it is going to be dug up and moved to Carrion and used as kind of a pawn in the game. We then have the characters return to their room, where Loyal briefly explains Das de Mar, the game of games that the Carrion play, has something to do with intrigue in the court and people who are high up, lords and ladies influencing the world. And that's basically all that he knows. They spend the night, they wake up, and Celine has gone with a not super nice note. And then they leave with some officers. It gets a little travel-y there. I don't have as many notes. This is an interesting chapter from my perspective, because if you were to sum up what are the things that change in this chapter from the last one, I think the answer is potentially a lot. But if you ask me how much happened in this chapter, my answer is basically nothing. So what is your take on this chapter that I think straddles that line between nothing and a lot happening?
I saw the Lord of the Rings reference coming, and I was like, oh, that'll be something cool. And then it was just the name of a tavern. So I was a little disappointed. I was like, oh, we're not actually changing the mythology or doing something grand. It's not a bad name for a tavern, all things considered, but it's just like, oh, it's kind of a mundane chapter as opposed to what I was imagining, certainly.
Yeah.
So my reaction, other than that silliness, is just to say it felt like our kind of bumbling, silly heroes wandered into Game of Thrones. And there's obviously a kind of direct language thing there with the Game of Games and Game of Thrones, but
and
it
a
just
food
felt
scene.
and a food scene. Good point. But it really just felt like you know it kind of returned to like, these are just a bunch of bumpkins, and even though if Rand's the only one who can really be called a bumpkin at this point here with this crew, and they have no idea what they're wandering into, where palace intrigue and politicking are really kind of all these people seem to live for.
Yeah.
A funny thing where I grew up is all of our hometowns had elementary schools 1st through 4th grade, and then you went a town over for the middle school, and you brought together all these other towns.
Yep.
My school I grew up in was so small, like 12 kids in a class, like 50 kids in the whole school. And then we got to the middle school, and we were eaten alive because it was only one town over, but it was like those kids who were in the other elementary schools, like, oh yeah, I dated him in kindergarten. You're like, wait, what? Like, that's a thing? Like, I wasn't thinking about dating for like 10 more years. Like, what are you talking about? And it just feels like that's the level Rand is at, where it's like, I had no idea this was a part of this world and an important part of this world. I think there's a real hat tip here that Maglin Madwin is so nervous around Rand that it's like, these lords are snobbish and brutal and just treat the commoners in terrible ways, which is actually all built into Game of Thrones. I think the show kind of washed that out, but there are a lot of scenes in the books where the characters are like, why do we let these assholes order us around and have us hack each other apart? We don't need to do these things. And so it certainly felt, in terms of, it felt like a different book, not in a negative way again, but just that like, oh, we're in a different society here, and there's very different rules. And that fits with what we've seen when we go to these major cities or new areas.
Yeah, and this actually really fits with what I learned in that nonfiction book I was referencing earlier. It talks about how Robert Jordan tried to kind of have each of the major civilizations in the Wheel of Time kind of feel grounded in one real world civilization, and then have that mixed with details from a lot of other mythologies and stories and things, so that it felt very different from our own world. But where the country that we have primarily been in, Andor, is primarily modeled after England, and then we get kind of the more rural version of that in the Two Rivers, which is technically a part of Andor. Carrion is much more modeled after France, and so that's where we see a lot more of kind of the focus on political and court intrigue. That's where we see the line between lord and commoner being significantly stricter, just in terms of where roles were in that era. And so I think we're seeing a lot of the kind of real world things map, and then we throw in the fantasy of it, and things feel just scrambled enough to feel new but familiar enough that we almost feel like we know Carrion a little better than we otherwise would. At least I do. Maybe that's because I've read it 800 times.
No, I agree with that, and I think that's what the best fantasy writers do. I was thinking about Serenity and Firefly, and how that just was like, oh, we'll just mix American and Chinese culture because that's where we're headed. And yeah, like that totally works, because then you see the symbolism of both, and it gives you something familiar. Other than that, I mean, I think it's clear that Celine is just totally out of control and is doing whatever she can to continue to hide this. Like we've said before, it really felt like a chapter before I finally got like the best read on her, and then I feel so clever in this chapter because I'm like, I know she's making the noise in the kitchen. I know she's interrupting for this reason. I know she's making this excuse. And I do think that is a credit to Robert Jordan to make you feel super clever that you figured it out, even if it's only like pages before like it should be really, really obvious. So I really liked I liked seeing I guess I liked the I guess it wouldn't be dramatic irony, because I know the characters know, and I know well, Rand doesn't know, so there's where the dramatic irony is. Rand doesn't suspect Celine necessarily yet, and so because I know she's up to no good, that was really fun to read through. And then other than that, I just have in my notes that they really want us to remember Tom. I can't imagine that Tom is not going to be here pretty soon, the way they keep reminding us over and over again of, oh, and this is how I learned to play the flute and so on, and his harp. And
as we're talking about Tom, I have two things to note. One is that this chapter literally has his icon on it, so it would make sense you would think that. The other is that whoever wrote the song in this chapter clearly needs Tom as an editor. What I mean by that is, here is how many syllables there are in each line of this song: 10, 7, 8, 7, 8, 15, 5, 5, 12. What? How can you sing that?
I'm sure there are a lot of TikTokers who try. I have to imagine, right?
Oh my God.
People have done versions of this.
I cannot wait until we get the Bear and the Maiden Fair version of this, where some rock band has to turn that into a meaningful song. Good luck.
I guess other things that are sprinkled in, the statues from the Age of Legends, not that I really would have expected anything else. And that they have run so afoul of this one lord's suspicions that they're now trapped with soldiers that are going to accompany them, which really seems to be the actual impetus for Celine disappearing, because she knows they're going to sniff her out. So those feel like really important, especially the second part feels really important for the next few chapters, or the next few Rand chapters. I haven't peeked at the next page yet. And yet aren't particularly exciting to talk about. They just feel important.
Yeah, I think the only other kind of thing to pull out of that is that you said it seems like Celine kind of disappeared in the night. That is not only true of Rand, who is oblivious to everything, that is also true of the commander, who seems to have had the inn watched and still didn't see Celine leave. So I don't think we needed more notes of Celine is sus, but here is another example. Something else is clearly going on here. I agree with you. This is one of those chapters where we are in a different place than where we start, but there's not much to say about it other than congrats, we got there. But
maybe just that I like all the taverns, like,
Yeah.
you know, taverns usually in fantasy, and I guess maybe I'm only talking about Patrick Rothfuss from my experience. It's like there's a tavern we hang out at and we learn about this. I think he has 2 or 3 in that city. But this has been a fun part of Wheel of Time, is going through all the different taverns over time. And, you know, I do like that as a bit of this culture. And there's, I mean, the very first part of Lord of the Rings has a tavern, but then that doesn't really become part of where it goes. So it stands out to me and is fun. You know, old New England, that is so much our culture up here that, you know, you still see, they don't have the cool names like in England, but each town has their inn that really was that.
Yeah.
And I know where I grew up in New Hampshire, there's just a house now, but it was like a really important tavern on this one road, and you can kind of trace all that. So that's all good. That's all interesting. Makes me want a pint, but yeah, nothing else to say.
Yeah, I mean, I associate that tavern myself with Dungeons and Dragons, right? I have played so many one shots that are just like, okay, all of you are in a tavern and you see a sign and here's where you start the adventure. And you know, there's actually something I think to be said about that in terms of what we're talking about is Lord of the Rings introduces, like, there's a tavern at the beginning. D&D turns that into a trope, and then Robert Jordan is almost like the first generation of fantasy writers writing having lived D&D in their childhood. It's kind of awesome to see that kind of emerge, and let me tell you, you will see a lot more taverns. A lot more taverns.
And it's where we are in fantasy right now, especially YA. There's just this huge generation of people who got into D&D like 10 years ago, and I don't mean that as like people who weren't in the 80s wave of D&D, but kind of in this resurgence, even on the leading edge of the resurgence 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And it's like remarkable how much that's shaping fantasy and other things. You know, a lot of those writers have come over into Star Wars. I just read one of the newest Star Wars writers is Sam Maggs, who I think has done Critical Role graphic novels prior to this, and is tied into the Critical Role. And it's like, yeah, like clearly she has a D&D mindset, and that works with this group of characters she's working with. But there's just a lot of that going on. So I think while that's probably going to be handed over to Gygax for his legacy, I think you're making a compelling case that it should be Robert Jordan.
Let me also say, I can't remember the dude's name, but it's Gygax, and read the articles. It's fantastic. Anyways, it is worth noting, I am done grumbling. I can't promise that these chapters will immediately get massively better than they were before, but I am pretty confident in promising that we will have a general upward trajectory from now until the peak of the series. So strap in.
Just to be very honest, though, I love you dearly. I've been your friend low these many years. You're not done grumbling, period. You're done grumbling about the chapters in the book. So I would hate for your brand to change this far into our friendship and our podcast.
Yeah, the day I am done grumbling is the day that you know I have been taken over by some sort of parasite. Like, that is how Last of Us starts, is Tylor doesn't grumble. So I appreciate that correction. Next week, we will be reading chapter 22, Watchers, and chapter 23, The Testing. Greg says he hasn't looked forward to see whether or not they are Rand chapters, and the only hint I will give you, well, I guess I'll give you two. One is that I think the book gets better in them, and two is that one of them begins with Moraine saying the least Moraine sentence you could possibly imagine. So with that little bit of hint, Greg, I will let you take us out of the episode.
Yeah, I got nothing to say. I'm going upstairs to read. So screw my family. I'm just going to go read some Wheel of Time. See y'all next week.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.